Hello and welcome to the Last Mile podcast, where we talk about the new technologies being used by the government to enable communications and connectivity off the grid. I'm your host for today's podcast and a frequent contributor to the Last Mile online publication, Ryan Schrade. Thank you for joining me. As many of you probably know, natural disasters and other emergency situations, things like hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes, not only do they cause casualties and destroy property, they also make the response effort more difficult by knocking out essential communications infrastructure. This can take the incredibly difficult job that first responders already face and make it nearly impossible. Puerto Rico's been hit by massive back-to-back hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, which slammed into the island just 2 weeks apart. Most recently, the island has fallen victim to earthquakes and aftershocks. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico knows firsthand just how destructive these natural disasters can be, and it knows the communications challenges that they create, as does our guest on today's show, Mr. Rafael Bobe. Rafael is the owner of Logistics and Consulting Group in Puerto Rico and a survivor of the many natural disasters that have plagued the island. He's here today to give us a first-hand account of what it was like to live through those terrible events and how a lack of communications following them greatly hampered the response effort. Rafael, thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to speak to us about something that I can only imagine is very difficult for you.
Hi, Ryan, and thank you for all your listeners of the Last Mile. It's a privilege and an honor.
Well, it's great to have you. Now, before we jump into some of the heavier topics, tell us a little bit about yourself and your company, Logistics and Consulting Group. Like, what type of solutions and services do you offer, and what types of organizations do you work with?
Well, basically, we are a technology-agnostic, solution-based company. We have been for a couple of years already getting solutions to our clients, specifically in the communications and energy areas, because that's something that you just can't separate from each other. And also helping them on the logistics on the grounds for those companies that, for example, during Hurricane Maria, we had a lot of energy companies that came in and they didn't know anything about Puerto Rico. And basically they were calling us saying, hey, I need you to set me up in the island. One of them that we proudly serve had 1,500 workers, from engineers, linemen, foremen, you name it. And we had to basically get them everything from meals, lodging, transportation, basically everything. And that was the moment that we hit a wall when SATCOMs basically were jammed. Everybody was trying to use a sat phone and they were getting jammed, and cell phone signal was down and people were getting desperate. And that was the moment when we found some solutions such as goTenna, for example, that really helped us to get going.
You mentioned Hurricane Maria, and obviously coming from Puerto Rico, a place that's just been rocked by natural disasters in the past few years, you're understandably very passionate about emergency and disaster response. You mentioned Hurricane Maria and some of the work that you did with some of the utility companies. How else did your organization help during those response efforts?
All right. Well, I can tell you that nobody knew what to do during that moment, and it's very difficult to explain how difficult it was those days being in the dark. When I mean in the dark is that you didn't know anything. You didn't know what was going on. You didn't have cell phone. You didn't have nothing. It was a complete chaos. And we basically work in the day-by-day basis because there were nothing else that you couldn't do. And during those moments, as I mentioned you, nonprofits were coming to us saying, I need you to help me because I can't connect with someone in X place. I can't find this person here. I can't find a vendor to get me a sat phone. I can't even text with someone, and that was where we saw that Puerto Rico was basically on the verge of collapsing totally.
No, I mean that sounds terrifying, and you've alluded to a little bit some of the chaos and the lack of the communications. But I mean, for many of us, here in the contiguous U.S., we've only really heard stories. We've only seen pictures of the devastation and the destruction. Can you give us a little bit better of a picture of what it was like on the ground following those natural disasters?
Basically, it was devastating. Yeah, you felt the anguish. It was like a loss of hope that is very difficult to describe. Unlike being on the mainland, for example, if you have a medical emergency and you live in Jersey and the best doctor to do your surgery lives in Connecticut, you just get in a car and drive 4 hours through I-95 and get over there to Connecticut. And you have access to that hope to get your surgery and for you to be able to live more, right? Here, we live in an island. So just by thinking on the logistical nightmare on getting supplies to Puerto Rico, you can fall really easy to a depression. And even worse, when you have kids. So getting groceries, that in those days was a nightmare. Getting gas for your car or for your generator was more than a nightmare. If you were lucky, that you had to do a 3-hour line. Normally it was like 8 hours at the beginning. So yeah, it's not something you could wish even for your worst enemy, because you didn't have anything. It was a loss of hope. It was hope.
And obviously, lots of devastation. You talked about following Maria, just the fact that there was, no cell phones. There was even satellite got jammed and became difficult to utilize. Elaborate a little bit more on some of those communications outages and tell us a little bit about how that impacted the response and the recovery effort.
Well, as I mentioned, we went totally dark right after landfall. No one knew what was happening. Everyone got desperate trying to get a hold of relatives and see if they were okay. The communication piece was really impacted the response and the recovery. Basically, every assessment, for example, I remember meeting with some government folks and they were sending brigades to the dark, not knowing where they were or if they were going to come back the same day, because I remember that same day after landfall, I drove from the south part of Puerto Rico to San Juan, and that was a normal 1 hour drive for me. It took me 3 hours because rocks, trees, everything was in the middle, bridges down, and a normal assessment that you can do by phone, it could have taken a week, because you had to send somebody, get the intel, come back, gather what they need, and then send them back again. And again, with the fear that if they're gonna come back, yes or no. So and the other problem, that lack of communication and outage caused that sometimes the help didn't get distributed well. Example of that. There were communities that everybody was focusing on them and they got a lot of help, but there were others that they didn't get anything. And that can't happen again, because sectors were getting something, that nothing was centralized, no communication, and a very difficult example that I'm going to give you is there was a community here in Puerto Rico called Levittown. Is next to San Juan, like 15 minutes away from San Juan. And a huge flooding happened, more than 5 feet of water already getting to the houses. People were on the rooftops of the houses. And one lady just grabbed her phone and miraculously, she got signal. And she sent a message through Facebook to the Washington, D.C. office called PRAFA, the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration. And the director of that office saw the message. The only thing that he saw was the message saying, "We're going to die huge flooding, 5 feet of water already. And he called the governor via his sat phone. He got a direct line. And immediately the governor didn't think about it. He didn't blink twice. And he sent the National Guard. When they got there, I only have to say is that if they were, the response didn't get 5 minutes, get a 5 minutes delay, a lot of people wouldn't die. I have to say hundreds of people would have died. And again, that happens when you don't have a robust, resilient communications infrastructure in place. And right now we don't have it. And that's the problem.
I'm glad that they got lucky and were able to get that message through. You raise a really interesting point there about, being able to communicate. I think that's something that a lot of people take for granted. We'll see, natural disasters happen in this country, and we'll see people start to mark themselves safe on Facebook and be able to call people. And that wasn't the case here. I'd love to get your opinion on why you think that was. Why was there such an impact to your communications networks, and what about them on the island resulted them in failing in these emergency situations?
Well, Ryan, everyone was relying on the wireless communications infrastructure, thinking like they're a magic wand. Well, they're not. They're not a magic wand. One of Puerto Rico's major communication companies lost more than its 85% of its network antennas. Okay, and most of the infrastructure wasn't properly maintained and were not resilient. No one thought that a Cat 5 hurricane will break us in pieces. So that was one of the problems. And another thing that some stakeholders and companies forget is that there's nothing such as a wireless network. They are dependent of a fiber optic line that goes to an antenna for it to send a signal that then connects your phone to the network. Just imagine if a 7-point-something earthquake hit us. I'll bet you anything that fiber optic will break and we will be on the dark again.
You're listening to the Last Mile podcast, where today we're discussing the unique communications challenges that follow natural disasters. I'm your host, Ryan Schrade, and I'm joined by Rafael Bobe, a resident of Puerto Rico that knows these challenges better than anyone. Rafael, you and I have spoken previously, and you are very outspoken about the benefits and capabilities of mobile mesh networking solutions. In fact, you've mentioned them a couple of times in some of your answers to some of my previous questions. Why are you such an advocate of mobile mesh networking, and what makes it a viable solution for enabling communications in emergencies?
This is something really personal, what I'm going to tell you. And again, if you hear my voice crack a little bit, don't worry. It always gets to me when I speak about this. And on September 20th, when Hurricane Maria made landfall here in Puerto Rico, me and my family went down to the south to be with my mom during the hurricane, so she weren't alone. And also because her house is like a bunker. and in that moment, I live in an apartment on an 18th floor, right? And my mom's house is even with Miami windows. So it was a really safe place to be during the hurricane landfall. After the landfall and going dark in communications, I lost total communication with her when I got back to the north, right? And basically by November 12th, she got some cell phone signal back again, okay? And she died on November 17th, 5 days later. It was really tough for me because we used to talk every day on the phone, specifically when my dad died 4 years before by a glioblastoma type 4 that he got on his brain. And when that happened, it was really shocking because the first thing that came to my mind was asking myself why I didn't do anything so we could communicate. At least a text message would have made a difference, a huge difference every day for say, hey, mom, I love you. Do you need anything? And not being able to do that really got under my skin. And I said, you know something, I'm gonna do everything that is on my power. On I'll put any resources that I can to help the people here of Puerto Rico not to go through the same thing I went through. Because again, just a simple text is a life changing, it's lifesaver, and it brings you comfort in the middle of things like that. That's why I'm such an advocate, and that's why I'm willing to do anything on my power to get this mesh network here in Puerto Rico up and running as soon as possible.
I'm very sorry for your loss. It's truly tragic, and I can't imagine how difficult that was for you, losing someone so important in the wake of a natural disaster like that. You talked about the mobile mesh networking and trying to get that stood up, and I know one of the steps that you've taken towards that is doing some testing of some different mobile mesh networking solutions. What did those tests look like? Who was involved in that, and what about the testing was interesting or maybe even surprised you? Those tests that you've done there on the island.
Well, the first test that we did, I first started by buying goTenna myself to see that it worked, and I loved it. I totally loved it, to be honest. And I said, all right, let me talk to the government. And when I went there, the former CIO during the former governor Ricardo Rosselló, he knew about goTenna, and he asked me and some and one of the goTenna's vice president, hey, I like this, but I need you to test it, right? And he sent us to a school on the middle of Puerto Rico, in the central part of Puerto Rico. I don't want to say in the middle of anywhere, but it's in the middle of anywhere. And it was the school that really got totally disconnected. Nobody knew what was happening on that community during Hurricane Maria. Let me tell you more. That community is so far up in Puerto Rico that I don't know if you are a fan of Jimmy Fallon, but Jimmy Fallon did some shows here in Puerto Rico, and he went to a place called Toro Verde, where they have the second longest zip line in the world. Well, Google it and see where it is, and you will see that that's in the middle of the mountains. Well, we sent a text message using goTenna Pro to a place called Engine 4. That's a co-working space in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. It was 23.1 miles distance, but with a lot of mountains in the middle. And what we did is we did a type of triangle meshing where the school director sent a message from his school, and we had a helo a couple of miles down, and the helo got it, and we put goTenna Pros on the helo, on parts of the helo, and used it as a repeater. And then obviously it bounced to us, and over there in Engine 4, on top of it, we had a drone 650 feet up, and we got the message, went down, and we received it. We were totally off grid. We were in airplane mode, by the way, and that was the moment we said, this works. This works perfectly. And the only hop that it only did one hop, and with goTenna Pro you can do 6 hops if you could. So, and Puerto Rico is 135, and that basically proved the concept. Immediately that happens, they called us from the governor's mansion. We want you here. And I remember Cale Teeter, Greg, the officer from goTenna, and I went to the governor's mansion. And he said to me, please install me one on my cell phone. And we installed a goTenna Pro on his cell phone. And he was, I don't know if you have seen how big is the governor's mansions in Puerto Rico. It's a fortress. It's 400, 300, 400 old building with thick walls. And he was inside the governor's mansion texting off grid with people on Bayamon. So, and when he did that, he was like, all right, if I can test with this guy of Engine 4 in Bayamon, which is like 5 miles away, then if I do a second hop from Bayamon, I can then reach Orocovis, 23.1 miles. And from Orocovis to the west part of Puerto Rico was like another 40 miles. So I needed 2 hops more for basically, he said, well, the governor from his desk can talk with any of the majors here in Puerto Rico. And we said, yeah, he can do it. We have the capability to do it with the right and precise repeaters put in place. Yes, we can do it.
That seems like a very exciting test. You may have gotten Jimmy Fallon up on that zip line, but as someone who has very, very frightened of heights, this is one show host that you will not get up on that zip line, I can assure you. So, you mentioned following Hurricane Maria that you worked with a handful of different NGOs and not-profit organizations during that relief effort. Were any of those organizations involved in the test? Did you get any reactions from any of them on how you were able to use this to communicate virtually anywhere on the island?
Well, if another Cat 5 comes in, we know that the repeater that we install may withstand those winds. But what happens if a tree gets broken and that tree goes flying away to our repeater and tears it down? Then we say, all right, let's then do and we develop a mesh network repeater infrastructure using aerostat blimps. And the SOP that we just developed is basically we will deploy them as soon as the emergency strikes. We will deploy them next day at 8 a.m. after the emergency with some goTenna Pro and goTenna mesh repeaters inside. Right? Those blimps can be with one refill of helium. They can be up 7 days. Okay, and normally the most crucial and critical hours of any emergency is the first 72 hours. Right? So that can cover that critical moment. Okay. Those 15 blimps will be strategically placed in areas in Puerto Rico where they can talk to each other because they have line of sight. So basically, if you're in Mayagüez, which is in the west corner of Puerto Rico, with those repeaters, you can talk with someone in Fajardo, which is 100 miles away, right? So we have a test already that was going to happen using drones because this was supposed to be already deployed, but COVID-19 basically delayed us a little bit. But we have already everything up and running and ready to be deployed. We're just waiting for the COVID-19 lockdown to go out so we can deploy it immediately. All right. And what we intend with this is basically to connect at least 180 nonprofit organizations that we know that they were working to help the communities during Hurricane Maria, so they can text each other. We were creating maps or where the warehouses, everything it is, so they can have off-grid maps on their goTenna Pro, so they can know where to go and when to go. So then we can have situational awareness or of where that truck is going. And if something happens, they can send an SOS message. Hey, my truck's broken. Send someone to help me. And that's also the backbone of a solid off-grid solution for the government of Puerto Rico because they need it. We're basically saying to them, hey, you don't have any excuse to do this because we already did the dirty work. And that's what we intend to do.
Sounds like you guys have an excellent plan for ensuring both communications and situational awareness following an emergency. Now, obviously hindsight's 2020, and we could always look back and say what if, but let's say you had that plan in place when Hurricane Maria happened. How do you think things would have been different?
Well, very different. very different. Example of that, for me and my family, using mesh network really helped. Every time I went to a grocery store or to the gas station, I tried to go areas that were on my range of our goTenna, right? And that way my wife and I will have always communication together. Second, if I don't have a good line of sight to her, or I'm not in range, I will deploy my drone, put a goTenna on top of it, and create my own repeater. So believe me, after being here, passing Hurricane and Maria, passing earthquakes, now COVID, and now a next hurricane season, believe me, you get creative. That was basically our main communication source when emergency happens and when we are overseas. I remember going to Egypt and using it because you don't have signal there. With nonprofits, the same. We have donated over 40 goTenna mesh, for example, to World Central Kitchen, and they used it over there in Bahamas when Hurricane Dorian was there. Because when you were for example, in Bahamas, in Nassau, you were fine, but if you go to Abaco, Gran Bahama, or other islands, you were totally dark. So believe me, makes a world of a difference having an off-grid messaging system such as goTenna.
Excellent. Obviously, Puerto Rico still recovering from many of these major disasters and two huge hurricanes and earthquakes that followed. I'd assume that part of that recovery is reestablishing emergency communication. So aside from some of what you talked about with the mobile mesh network, what else is being done today to ensure that communications are available following natural disasters?
Well, let me tell you something. Unfortunately, nothing that we know. I'm being very modest on my answer, but no. What we have seen from some summits given last year by the Puerto Rico Emergency Management Agency is that they are trying to do a more solid wireless network. Again, that's a huge mistake because the effect of a disaster can't be predicted, and you need solutions that can withstand any situation. That's why I've been so advocate on a mesh network, because you can't predict how it's gonna hit you, but if you have a solution that can withstand anything, then you are in a better position of responding on that emergency.
Here in the contiguous U.S., the news cycle's kind of moved on, and we haven't really heard much about what's been going on in Puerto Rico, following the hurricanes, following the earthquake. I'm sure our listeners would just love to know, aside from the communications networks and everything else, how's the recovery going? How's the rebuilding going? Is Puerto Rico rebuilding? What's the progress look like right now?
Well, Ryan, I can tell you that it has been long and slow. Okay, long and slow, until the government of Puerto Rico don't move fast and according to the times that we live in, and they get rid of the red tape that is basically holding the fundings to go where they need to go for the rebuilding. We are right now basically going to war naked. That war is the next hurricane season that is officially starting in 12 days. Just imagine this. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Earthquakes nonstop since January, plus hurricane season. Now imagine if a Cat 3, or let's go back. Imagine a Cat 1 earthquake, a hurricane hitting us. In the middle of the pandemic, which you need to have social distancing, plus a 6.5 earthquake hit us. That's why I always encourage my clients and encourage people through social media or in when they go to my office is you need to prepare. You need to have your communication systems. You need to have a goTenna. You need to have at least food for 30 days. You need to have your backpack in case of an earthquake hits us, and you need to basically leave everything. You need to have your car ready with stuff for your family, for your pets, for basically, because you don't know what is going to happen, and that's why it's called an emergency. An emergency is you don't know what is going to happen, what you don't know where they're going to get you, strike you, and you need to prepare. And one of the things that you really need to prepare for is the communications, because if you're in the middle of an emergency and there's no way you can communicate with someone, it's going to be a very difficult moment for you. So I encourage everyone to prepare, no matter what the type of emergency or natural disaster you can come through. Just prepare, because preparing and be able to have everything that you need just in case something happens, it will be life-changing for you and your family.
Rafael, while it's certainly discouraging that there's so much that needs to be done and so much that could be done to help prepare the island for the next earthquake or hurricane, it is encouraging that there's people like you there to lead the charge and to help establish the priorities and identify new technologies that could help make a difference. You've been listening to the Last Mile podcast, where we've been speaking with Rafael Bobe of Logistics and Consulting Group, a resident of Puerto Rico with firsthand knowledge of the island's recent struggles following a number of devastating hurricanes and earthquakes. Rafael, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and our listeners and for sharing your story. I'd also like to thank you, our listeners. If you liked what you heard here today, I'd encourage you to check out the Last Mile online publication at connectthelastmile.com for even more content like this.